So welcome to Poetry Thin Air. I'm George Spencer, and we have with us this evening Jeff Wright, who I want to thank for coming to see us and agreeing to talk.
Thank you, George Spencer. It's great to be here with Mitch Corber filming us.
Okay. I wonder, could you start out, Jeff, by reading one of your poems called Blast Off for Kicksville?
Blast off for Kicksville! Blast off! It's party time! Here are beavers from Japan on the new WFMU afternoon show with your host, Greg. Fresh toasted, you're a little Danish. Double misfits with Some Kind of Hate. Splendor and Squalor on Avenue B. It was like Devastation Angels. That song called Seduction, Frivolity, Momentum, and Design. You should read 20 poems for each poem you write. Dedication, perseverance, and yeah, right. I was so useless, I felt like doing something useful to make up for it. I'll have what she's having new from the Tuna Helpers on their full-length circus song, Imagination, Devotion, and Drive. Now you're using your noodle. Now we're having mild fun. We're working for better gnomes and gardens. Fit of pique, you're famous for intransigence, belligerence, and spite. What do you call a turkey from Turkey? Eponymous. You, the slippery cyclone waterspout in F major, thrown for a bone, that was the cure in between things. My little slam-a-lammy, meet the Pied Piper of Bozoville. You are the rose of the valley, truth, beauty, and will. A carousel of candles, lit only in dreams. A cup of honeybush tea, my steaming brew. I'll lick the braille off your elevator button, you. Don't think I won't. Don't hide from me. New from the dervishes, new from the perishers, from your wrecking ball to your fashion shows. I think you're overreacting. You're raising my shadows. Sacrifice, devotion, and mush. And this goes on for a little while, George, and it ends up on the night Telemann dies, or Telemann was born, actually. Telemann was born today, March 14th in 1681, and the amateur wankers are back in town after playing South by Southwest in Austin, Texas. 38 degrees now on St. Mark's Place, and this page, too, should live without age, love, hope, and faith.
Yeah. Well, let's go back to sort of the beginning. How did you get here to New York? You grew up in the West Virginia mountains, right?
Yeah, we moved around a lot, and we have family in West Virginia. And I got here from publishing connections. I had been selling books door to door.
Oh, really?
In college, yeah, and it was nice. And I was in the South all over down there, Missouri, Georgia, different summers. I even led a crew from West Virginia down there. So I made enough money, and I came up here in the dark days of '76. Settled right here in the East Village, luckily, and within 6 months was going to St. Mark's, reading at the open readings, you know, worshiping Ted Berrigan and Alice Notley.
Who else was there besides those two?
There was quite a few people. Ann Waldman, Allen Ginsberg was there. Gregory Corso came around sometimes. Jim Brody was teaching a workshop. The workshops were always open. You could always go. You could walk in the door for free. You know, Bukowski came and read, and before it burned in '78 too. There were the old pews in there, and it said stuff like Peter von Fleet or something, you know, and you'd be sitting there, the one next to you'd be all broken down. Out of my magazine, Live magazine.
Yeah.
Yeah, which was invented to be a live event, plus have a hard copy of the magazine, plus have a website. But it came from Live Mag, and I published this in there. Al-Qaeda on the Western Front. The last locust leaves leave their last lashes of gold, crackling in whip crisp blue November glare. listening to Tasty Fare by the Losing Streaks, let us reflect on the unspeakable. In the face of the unfaceable, I beg you to dance. I say, shake it up. Before that, we heard the Riviera Playboys. How do you call the dumbwaiter? I am known of mine, secret admirer. Live, flee, or die.
One of the things about this poem that I particularly liked, Jeff, was the fact that it's got 3 different styles in it. The first couple of lines are sort of traditional lyric with alliteration and lyric imagery. And then it switches over into a sort of a pop, bunch of pop references. And then at the end becomes quite heavily ironic. And was this something that you planned when you were writing it? It just happened?
It does more happen, you know, but it does start with Al-Qaeda, and it ends with live, flee, or die. And those 2 things seem connected to me. So there's an umbrella around it, so it feels like it needs to wrap it up at the end. And then I said I was cribbing, I don't know if I said that, but I was like reading Jefferson's Bible, Thomas Jefferson. So I always like to have text around me. That's another reason to have the radio on, like Ted Berrigan said, because you just have those words floating there. And it's the same when I'm writing in a notebook. The words are out there, and and Alice Notley helped me learn that lesson in one of her workshops. Now, no questions asked is kind of like, again, you know, dealing with that dark side if you're not allowed to ask questions here. And turning it on its head and making it a statement of freedom. And no questions asked. Whatever you can get your hands on, that's an okay start. Night, too, will sleep with us, as black as the enabler of alabaster. I'm amazed at sailors from Marseille, prisoners as they are of salt cavern dreams. In our spiral echo redoubt, nothing collapses forever. Therefore, look here, you who know a spell or 2, always invent the truth.
A poem like that, which I think to some extent goes by association from one thing to the next, does that require a different way of reading than sort of a traditional, perhaps Wordsworth poem or Robert Frost poem that tends to have a storyline or an arc in it?
Well, I think that's a difficulty that the poet needs to be aware of. You can't expect people just to go along with your every whim. And I think these poems are a little bit difficult. They rely, for instance, to me, in the changing textures and the sort of embedded opposites like black and alabaster, and then the catchphrases and words that you're used to, like enabler, but maybe not in this context. And the whole talky thing is like, well, I'm really talking to you. Whatever you can get your hands on, that's an okay start. That's really talk. But then it goes into this whole thing about, I'm amazed at sailors from Marseille. So it's all, then it becomes just a little bit of music. Amazed, sailor, Marseille. And that just kind of comes out when you're writing it. And so you feel like, well, I'll have to go with that, because that
so
just came
what this
out.
means is the person who's reading this has got to understand this is not going to be your traditional beginning, middle, and end. And they're going to have to do more work in this than reading this than they would in a more traditional poem.
Maybe. Although they're short, and they can just barrel through them and get what they want out of them, and look at them and say, no, I'm not trying to get anything out of this either. I'm just going to go for the ride. It's like, you know, when you go to Coney Island, it's like...
So when you're writing, are you to some extent going for a ride also?
Absolutely, yeah.
And so you don't have don't start out with an idea, okay,
not
you know,
usually.
the tree is going to snow on the trees, and that means this and that.
Well, 2 things. One was Ginsberg told me one time, says, you're not using iambic pentameter or something like that? And I said, no. He says, then you're writing by the seat of your pants. And it's true. I am writing by the seat of my pants. I can barely hold on, and a lot of times it doesn't work. But sometimes I feel like it really just has its own thing.
Well, let me interrupt you
Yes, please.
Tell me about Ginsberg.
Alan was great to have around. He was a taskmaster. He was very generous in many ways, and he was supportive. But he also expected you to write in a way that he was prescribing. Like when I studied with him, that was what he was doing in the workshops. He would come in with a stack of books he wanted you to be reading, whereas most workshops in the university, it's like you're working on your own thing more. It was great to be around him, and when his visitors would come, like Corso or Herbert Hanke, that's how I met Herbert Hanke and Michael McClure. Sometimes he would say, "Jeff, could you take this guy over to the coffee shop, kill an hour?" I'd be like, "Yes." I'd have him sign my little books, and Herbert Hanke drew a picture. And he was around the neighborhood. He wrote a foreword for my first book. The other thing I think I was going to say about these, though, is I think they do scan. They scan quite well, even though I'm not writing them with meter in mind. I think they become very metric, and on the page they scan quite well. They're generally fairly sculpted, some more than others. In fact, I'm trying to break up some of that sculpted in my later stuff and throw in giant capital letters and things, because I was thinking again about the difficulty for the reader, and I'm thinking, and with collage, the way we pursue and peruse the world at this point is in a much more shorter burst. So you can look at a poem and maybe only read one line on that page. I know when I get poetry books, that's how I read them too. I just open them up, I start reading here wherever I want to. I may get through a whole poem, I may not. You know, I may read 5 poems in a row. I may end up reading the whole book.
So I think what you're really saying is there's a different way of reading modern contemporary poetry.
Yeah, I think it's a little more cubistic. You know, my son said you could take these lines and move them and switch them from one poem to another. And you know, you could do that in a lot of ways. But there are other resonances that also are not necessarily apparent. They're not necessarily equational meanings like Robert Frost, where the road splits. It's a solid metaphor, and you never switch the metaphor. You stay with that road the whole time. Because, you know, he did that. So now we have to try to do other things. So you have other kinds of associations coming in, like philosophy.
Speaking about switching things and sonnets, and these are all sonnets. These are 14 lines, and you know, so they're sonnets at least in name. When did Berrigan do his sonnets that he turned everything upside down? Do you remember? Were you around at that time?
No, I wasn't around.
No.
I was. I had started writing poems in high school, but I was influenced more by E. Cummings.
Okay.
He was a great liberator, and Ted did those in the early mid '60s.
They were that long ago, right?
Yeah. And he was teaching a lot of people. He was having a big influence, and he was also associating with a lot of the artists, like Andy Warhol and George Siemens, who I mentioned. And when you read his sonnets, he had some of the same strategies I went into with my latest series of sonnets, which was to have several motifs and possibly even repeat some lines. And so that gives you an armature to drape these poems over. Because it's a hard thing to do to sit down and write a poem. And if you make it too constructed, then it's clunky. It's got to have this zippy freedom, you know.
Well, let's move on. Why don't you read, if you would, Questar?
Let's see. Now, Questar, I think, is a little more formal in the sense that you could follow it. Questar. How do you feed a dream? Just give it any old thing. How do you choose a wave? Look for one that's blue. How do you start a war? Rattle a big rusty sword. How do you see it through? Peer into the open forge. How would you steal time? Squeeze it? Make it rhyme? How could you write a poem? Dig so deep you end up home. When all these things are done,